Shikalji, how are you?
I'm good, Sat Shri Akal ji. I'm good. How are you?
Very good, very good. How
Nice to meet
colorful.
you.
Such a beautiful background.
Ah,
Is that a painting that you've done yourself?
it is. Yes, it is one of
Lovely.
my paintings.
I love the vibrant colors. Very, very
Thank you.
nice. Yeah,
Yeah,
lovely. So you're based in Quebec, is that correct?
that's right. Montreal, Quebec.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm here in Birmingham in England, right in the
Ah,
center.
okay.
Yes.
Nice, nice.
Have you been to England before?
Oh, yes. I was actually there during my secondary education years. Then I came to Canada. Then I went back to Oxford and then I was there for another 8 years in
Okay,
UK.
wonderful,
So
wonderful. So,
I love UK.
yeah, okay, brilliant.
I
So
have an
what?
affinity for it.
Yeah. Well, my sister lives in Vancouver, so
Oh, yeah.
yeah, I've been to the. That's I know it's a long way from where you are, but
Yeah.
it still can. There are a lot of similarities between Canada and England, and so it's great to know that you went to secondary school here in England. Is it okay if we go into our dialogue? Is that okay with you?
Sure, no problems.
Okay, wonderful.
Yeah,
Yes,
no
because
problem.
yeah,
Yeah.
excellent.
And have
So
you ever been to Canada
yeah,
here in this
Vancouver.
area? No. Just Vancouver, right?
It's
Okay.
Vancouver, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, up to now, just Vancouver. But
Yeah.
so I've been in most nearly all of my education. In fact, I can't think of any of my education that's taken place outside of the UK. Well, apart from 2 years, I went to Punjabi school in the Punjab before we came to England, and
Uh-huh.
we've been in England since I was about 6 years old. So I went.
Mm,
I managed to get 2 years in before I came here. So I learned how to read and write in Punjabi, but
nice.
it's only at a very basic level, unfortunately.
So
So
important. So important, isn't it?
it is. It is.
What a gift
I
it is
feel
to have.
I feel grateful that at least I can read the Japji Sahib, I can read the Reras, I can read as much as I need to read for now, and then
Yeah.
later on I will, when I have a bit more time, I will
Mm.
go more deeply into it. But so my education being in England, there are only a few occasions where I felt that I could relate to the Sikhi aspect of my life. Very much it was a question of like when I went to school, I learned about European history, and the only kind of history that I learned about Sikhi was from my own family and from my own community. So it was on an informal level. And I remember being in secondary school when we learned about the Reformation, about how Martin Luther created the Protestant kind of ideology, and that led to this great kind of wave of direct access to God being important, and
Mhm.
the importance of being able to read the Bible. So Martin Luther, made sure that the Bible was written in the local vernacular, which was revolutionary in those days. And I saw the connections between Guru Nanak Ji, and I thought, there was no one I could discuss this with because at home they didn't know about Martin Luther, and at school they didn't know about Guru Nanak. And so
Yeah.
and at my school there was only one other Punjabi girl, and she didn't really care about the similarities and differences and whatever. So for you, as you were growing up in secondary school, did you have opportunities to make connections between what you were learning from the different worlds that we inhabit?
Oh, absolutely. I came to the UK from Nairobi, Kenya. I was around 13 at the time. So I went into a secondary school. It was, a grammar school in Surrey. And I was the only Indian girl there. And I had to learn to fit, get myself kind of fit into the society over there. And it took me quite a while to be able to understand what was going on around me. And there was no one that could actually guide me. The only thing I remember is my principal or headmistress, I should say, at the time. She'd come. When I went to the school, she said to me, she said, Jasvinder, that's my name. She said, she says, I only have one thing to say to you. And she said, just remember that if you do anything bad, you will be noticed. And if you do anything good, you will be noticed.
Mm.
And I thought that was very profound for me at the time. Because I was different, because I stood out, I had a chance of either, sort of getting this side of the attention or the other side of the attention. And fortunately, I chose the other side, the one that, was going to give me the right kind of attention. And in terms of learning religion or other cultural aspects, it was a very difficult time for me, to be honest with you. There were no gurdwaras around at the time. And so we were located in Kingston, and we didn't have a car that we could just drive and go to another gurdwara. But I had been brought up, and I went to a school, a Khalsa school, when I was in Nairobi. And so I already had a little foundation where I was able to read Punjabi, and my mom had taught me, to do Japji Sahib and Kirtan Sola. And that's all I knew about Sikhism. I didn't know anything else. One other thing that was very good about being in Kenya at the time was that we were part of many cultural groups, and we felt integrated into them, whether it was Gujarati or Muslim or any. So that was a beautiful feeling that I had, that we were all one, basically. So I carried that feeling when I went into this school, and actually forgot all about my culture,
Mm. Mhm.
because there was no one to teach
Yes.
me anymore about it.
Mm.
I just went
Well, that's
on.
understandable. That is understandable. But the thing is, you see, that what I have noticed is that people like yourself you had your early kind of childhood in Kenya or Uganda or Tanzania, I noticed that the self-esteem is much higher than those of us who went to primary school, like myself, with only one other girl who could speak my language, my mother tongue, because you came from an education where you were valued, you were part of a culture of diversity, whereas I was someone who was not allowed to speak my language, and I'm sure that made a a big difference in terms of our own kind of self-identity and self-belief.
When you say you were not allowed to speak your language, you mean in the school or
Yes,
at
in the
home
school.
or
No,
in
in the
school?
school. Yeah.
Oh,
So
yeah.
at home, my,
Mm,
my parents only spoke Punjabi. They couldn't speak English. And at school, I wasn't allowed to speak the language I spoke at home,
mm.
and for a whole year, in my very first year at primary school, for a whole year, I refused to speak. Not because I couldn't, but just because that was my rebellion. I
Yes.
refused to speak for a whole year, and
Wow.
and as a result of that, I was put in what was called the dunces class. I don't think they're allowed to use that word now.
No,
You're not
no.
allowed to say dunces class, but it was called the dunces class in those
It was
days.
at the time, yes.
You see, so I was put in that class because of my language, and others were put in that class because they had behavioral issues, and
Mm,
so that was the class, that was the melting pot for everyone that they considered to be troublesome in some
yeah.
way, so um and the only other girl who spoke Punjabi, I don't know if she was born in England, but she certainly spoke some English, because her parents were educated, and her parents could speak English. My parents couldn't speak English. We'd only recently come to the country, you see. So that kind of gave me, I didn't have that safety net of being able to draw on the resources of my family. No one in my family could speak English at that point,
Mm,
as I
mm,
say.
mm,
And so, yes, I have noticed the higher level of confidence of people who came here from Africa, because when they came here from Africa, it meant that they already had developed skills that enabled them to kind of like have that social and cultural capital that put them at a different rung in the ladder, as it were.
mm.
But I
And it,
suppose, everyone's experience is unique. And so for somebody like yourself, if there was, your experience would be very different if you were in London, in Southall, for example, where you were surrounded by other people who were like yourself. But if you
mm,
were in a school where you were the only person, then maybe that wouldn't be an advantage like it would be for other people. But yourself and myself, both being educators, we know that one of the ways that we learn is by attaching new things to things that we know already. And I think that's one of the points at which there was this disadvantage, that when I was learning about Martin Luther, or when I was learning about European history, there wasn't anything, there wasn't, my family weren't kind of like teaching me about Henry VIII, or they weren't talking about all these things that the other children thought were everyday knowledge. And so it was that disadvantage of not being able to make those connections. And of course, you and I both survived. Obviously, we learnt at a very high level, and so we overcame that. But it's not natural to everyone. It requires a bit more effort to
Mhm.
overcome those gaps. And I suppose one of the reasons I'm doing this project now is to be able to highlight the importance of synthesizing. So, for example, when Guru Nanak Dev Ji had the ideology of equality, egalitarianism, and we connect that with what Martin Luther was saying, in my mind, I was able to remember that more than, for example, the other gurus. I can't think of like what was happening at the same time when they were saying, preaching a certain thing, what else was happening, because I can't make those, or I haven't up to now made those connections. It's more difficult for me to remember their message and and what the context was at that point. Another thing I remember making connections with is that at school, people knew who Gandhi was, but at home, I knew who Bhagat Singh was, and I knew Bhagat Singh to be the freedom fighter that we elevated and we put on a pedestal. But nobody at school knew who Bhagat Singh was, and
Mhm.
and so then the question is, well, why? Okay, let's think about the purpose of education, and why do we learn? What do we learn? And who chooses who the role models are meant to be? And so, who is it that decides that Gandhi should be the role model rather than Bhagat Singh? You see, so there are all these kind of connections which somebody like myself, I wasn't able to debate these at school because I didn't have, my teachers didn't know about my kind of pre-existing concepts and my beliefs and my personal history, I suppose.
Mhm. Yes, I think we've gone through the exact same kind of a mold, where there was not much discussion at home at all. You were led, you were left to your own means of just progressing in the school, because that's all I knew, that, okay, I got to get good grades in whatever I've been given. I had absolutely no idea about Indian history or just a basics of Sikh history. And for that period of my life, my time, all of them were buried.
Mhm.
I was very fortunate that when I did come to Canada, and so things, I had done my A levels by that time, and I'm starting college. And in Canada, we have a system where we go for 2 years in college and then university begins. Those 2 years of college are exploratory time for you to try and take any course that you wish. Obviously, you choose one stream that you want to follow. So if I was following the scientific field, I will take courses related to that. But then there were those extracurricular subjects where you can choose to enhance your knowledge about other historical figures or other people, religions, etc. And I found that very, very useful to me. During that time, I began to explore other cultures, other uh, books, poetry, languages, everything. Um, while I was in the UK, I was in a box,
Mm.
in that box. But then that box began to open, and I thought, oh my gosh, there's so much out there to learn. And so I'm very grateful that I had that period where I was able to, find myself. And fortunately for me, um, just when I started college, second year university, I was kind of hooked up to get married,
Mhm.
you know, and And that again was not something of my own choice. You know how it is for the girls. It's time ho gaya vyah kar diyo hone nada, education is not given priority. And here I had dreams. I wanted to become a doctor. And what came out of that was कोई ना ब्याह कर लो फिर जो मर्जी करना करी जाओ, that kind of thing. And with four brothers, no father, and my mother not, completely, with a formal education, she that was the pressure that I had to follow under. But all to say that those are few boundaries that we still learn to go beyond
Mhm.
because of the desire, that is within, to learn more about who you are intrinsically. And it's not about the education, the intellectual language, but also, the spiritual language that I wanted to know. And so that's where, in that period of my time where I got a scholarship to go to college. I was delighted, but then I had to forfeit it. Why? Because I couldn't. Now I had to get married. I got married with the promise from my husband that you could go to evening school. But I was very, very happy and to do that, and I persevered through 4 or 5 classes in the evenings for a long time, just so that I could get my degree, and I got my bachelor's from there. But during that time is when I rediscovered my Sikhi.
Mhm.
After all that break of not being able to do anything, etc., not knowing, not wanting to know, nothing. I had 3 boys by the time that I came,
Mhm.
and their hair was cut.
Mhm.
Because I didn't have that feeling inside me for what Sikhism was and what it was required. But then, you know, things happen the way they're meant to happen.
Mhm.
And a certain person came into our lives that started telling us about Sikhism. And I had learned Sangeet while I was in Nairobi, had taken my first, second lessons of harmonium and stuff. And they said to me, they said, why don't you do some kirtan?
Mhm.
And I said, but I haven't done it for such a long time. They said, no, no worries. Anyway, to cut the story short, during that period, the Gyaniji at our Gurdwara was deported. They
Mhm.
had no one to do any kirtan.
Mhm.
Guess who had to do kirtan over there? It was like there was like a calling back, and here I was, not knowing my own religion being put in the forefront to sing about it, to learn about it. And that's where the transformation began, where I began to delve deep into that part of it that began to tell me the message of
Mhm.
Guru Nanak and my other gurus.
Yes. You see, what you've said is really powerful because it demonstrates that we learn in very profound ways. And that learning, that calling, it didn't happen in a classroom. It happened through a connection. It
Mm,
happened through a connection, and it happened through the external circumstances creating that vacuum for you to step in. That opportunity was just, it was obvious it was meant for you. And so it's that kind of, when we do research, we know, like, there are, depends on whether we do research in social sciences or whether we do research in natural sciences, but I'm a social scientist, so I know that when I do research, I'm always questioning myself in terms of, well, why do I want to research this? We have to stop. We do have to ask ourselves that question, don't we? And it's like, it's not always obvious. My research for a long time was about creativity. I still continues to be creativity. And then, like, I read an article. It was called The Wounded Researcher. The Wounded Researcher. And when I read the article, I could see that when I left school, I wanted to do art, but my brother advised me not to do art because that wasn't the kind of subject I would get a job in. And he advised me to do science subjects. And
Yes.
so there was that kind of crushed spirit, I suppose, of like, I love your paintings behind you. And it's like, I wish that I had done art and developed that. But I found a different way of doing it. But to cut long story short, it's like the wounded researcher is that sometimes the research that we do, it's to it's that unfinished business, and it's that kind of calling from within, which is
Mm,
not logical. It's
mhm,
not always logical, and that takes me to this pathway between our Western education and the education of Sikhi. So, for example, Newton 1643, and Guru Harai 1644. He became guru at 1644. So contemporaries, they both lived round about the same time. And whereas with Newton, we have his ideas led to a very kind of logical, atomistic, mechanistic kind of thinking,
scientific, yeah.
scientific, yeah, the scientific method, and it led to the industrial revolutions, and a lot of material wealth has come out of that. And on the other hand, Guru Harai, who I don't know that much about, but the little that I do know is that he was very much into environmentalism.
Yes.
he
Mhm,
he was I remember I've read the story about how he, with his robe, a flower was crushed, and he was upset about
mhm,
having crushed a flower, and he was very sensitive to and advocated herbalism and planting trees, and all of that. And so we look at the two pathways, one of the ecological environmental approach, and the other one of the very mechanistic materialistic kind of approach. And it's as though we have put one, the Newtonian way, we've put that on a pedestal because that led to the material kind of wealth, all the industrial revolutions. And then we're just kind of coming back into the environmental aspect now. The West is waking up to the ecological importance, and now we can draw on Guru Harai and say, oh, but he said that 400 years ago. It's not new, we have just forgotten about it. So how do you see these kind of like these different pathways, and how do we synthesize and bring these pathways together?
well, you know what? This analogy that you've brought and this connection between the scientist part and of course I call it more the the spiritual, the inner, the artistic formation form of art or education, directed through our interest in ecology or anything else. Now, it, I am that, you know, as a scientist and as an artist. I believe that we are interconnected from the most material and tangible perspective to the most subtle or absolute perspective. You know, you know, anything like science tells us that matter is made up of nothing but atoms and subdivided atoms, and you go further and further and further until you come to just waves and vibrations. And we are that. We are that, but what we see, when I see you, I don't see those vibrations because I don't have the consciousness to see it. But as an artist, I'll share a little story with you about how, I started with mantra art. Why I write those thousands of Vahegurus in each painting that I make. And where that connection comes in from that science mode of me and the one that is more spiritually inclined, because I know what the basic truths that Guru Nanak Dev Ji and Guru Har Rai Sahib Ji or anyone else that has, they've all given us the same message, and it needed to be sort of kind of synthesized, merged. And I didn't do it on purpose. I just remember during that, as I told you, there was a change coming in my way of life, and I was a teacher in a secondary school at the time, and I had attended a smagam. Do you understand a smagam? like a retreat, maybe,
Mhm.
a retreat
Okay.
of several days where you go and you stay there, and in an atmosphere of a lot of meditation on the word Vaheguru, the mantra. So I had attended that, and I had just come back to school after the like a 10-day retreat, and I'm sitting there. There was the class was doing a test, and I was sitting there just looking there like this. And I think what happens is that when you've been in a very focused environment, it kind of penetrates into your own consciousness. And there I was sitting there, and I just picked up a pencil and I started writing the word Vaheguru over and over again. And it happened to be in one of my other paintings that I had on my desk, and it was a this flower with a hummingbird in it, and I had written Vaheguru within a heart in each of them. I had never done this before. I had never thought of it before, but yet it appeared there for me. And when everybody left and I came back to it, it was like something, whoa, what's that? And I looked at it and I said, I love that. And what had happened was that two things had come together for me. I knew and I wanted to believe so badly that everything around me was that consciousness, whether it's a flower or it's a bird or a person or even a cup, that it is nothing. And because matter tells us, doesn't matter solid, liquid, whatever it is, nothing but that. So I started writing that. And when I started sharing it with people, they connected to it immediately with that consciousness. So I was very grateful for that scientific background that brought me to that understanding, to actually apply it to the very message of Guru Nanak of omnipresence, of oneness, of being everywhere. And so that became um, the mantra for me.
Mm.
So as I produced, more and more paintings, it was that I wanted to infuse in them, so that people could get that message from me without me having to say anything.
Mm. Yeah, that is really powerful. And this concept of oneness, for me, I think of it as energy. Like
Mhm.
when we think of energy, like your energy, my energy, the energy of everything around us, it's like energy, there is no division. Energy just kind of merges into everything else, doesn't it? And matter, it's like it's, again, like going back to Newton, it's as though we have, we've started to focus too much on matter rather than on energy. And we
Mhm.
know that there is like an interplay between matter and energy. But if we're only focusing on the matter and not focusing on the energy, that's where we are selling ourselves short. So, for example, when I was saying to you, people who come from, in my experience at least, when people come from Africa, as opposed to somebody like myself who came straight from the Punjab, they tend to exude more confidence, and that confidence is not tangible, it's energy. There's an energetic kind of confidence. And I always used to say to my students, when I was teaching teenagers, I used to say, it's not about the qualification at the end of your course, that it's not the qualification that will make a difference, it's how confident you are. And that confidence is the energy. And I think that through
Absolutely.
education, we're not focusing as much on developing people's energy as we are on developing their, the material kind of tangible. There seems to be more focus on
Absolutely.
tangible things. Yeah.
It's all about focusing on the physical rather than taking it at a different level. And talking about energy, is that's who we are. And you're absolutely right in the fact that I might call that energy consciousness. That whatever been able to penetrate within you, within that energetic consciousness, is what you project when you go out in the world. It goes with you. And in fact, Gurbani tells us that we take it with us beyond this physical self also. Whatever is, trickle down to the base levels of our consciousness is who we are, what we are, and we project that energy whenever we even enter a room. So that is, that's what I want to be able to to remember all the time. You know, that oneness, that, we live in a relationship with each other, and we affect each other in all sorts of ways, whether it's physically or emotionally or spiritually or just simply mentally. But that's what education is all about.
Yes. And also, when we are conscious of the energetic kind of form of our being, we know that we learn so much through osmosis. You know,
Oh, yes.
we go to the Gurdwara and we may not understand the words, we may not understand, literally what the poetry is saying, but the energy of those words, we learn through osmosis, through the energetic, vibrations of those words, don't
Yes,
we?
yes. And that's why, the concept of Sangat
Mm,
is so important in Sikhism, because if you go into a situation of higher consciousness Sangat, your own consciousness also gets elevated during that process of, whether you want to call it osmosis, diffusion, whatever, it is going, that you begin to feel that sense of upliftment,
mm,
because
yeah.
you've been in the sangat of higher souls,
Mm.
you know.
And when you talk about the retreat, that's what I was thinking about. It's like you could go to a retreat and not say a single word. There are
Mm.
retreats where it's total silence, and even through that total silence, you learn through osmosis. You came back out of that retreat and an idea emerged, for you to do your art in a particular way. That idea emerged, it was being incubated perhaps during that retreat, and then suddenly it comes to the forefront. And that's part of that creative process, isn't it, of like.
Oh my gosh, yes. And it is so very, very important to understand that education is not happening only in school, in the
Mm,
classroom. It's all around us in the community level. A lot of it is happening at that time period, and who we intermingle with and choose to have as company is extremely important, because that's where your energy level is going to go higher, if you want it to go higher, or it could be affected the other way if the company that you're keeping is vibrating at a lower level, and so hopefully, with that, that's why Gurbani keeps on telling us, go go and find the sangat of those people who are already connected with God.
mm. Yeah, this whole kind of thing about we learn through osmosis. I remember being a teenager and my parents didn't want us going out with our friends to pubs, for example, or clubs. And I
Mm.
remember my younger sister, she wanted to go out with her friends to these clubs. And looking back at it, it's like I think my parents were right in the sense that even if she didn't drink, or if I didn't drink, even if like we're in that environment of like a pub environment where everyone else is drinking,
Mm, mhm.
we learn through osmosis there. It's like we those vibrations, the vibrations of people when they are smoking and drinking, for example, the vibrations will have an impact on
Absolutely,
on
yes.
us. Yeah.
Yes. You are the company you keep.
Mm.
You become that. And so it is up to us to choose the company. So, if we are intermingling with those that are know a lot more than us, are, they understand life at different levels. Well, sitting with them, we will learn something that will also elevate our consciousness,
Yeah.
and other way around, like you said.
Absolutely, yes. And again, there's this thing about the importance of seeing ourselves in the stories that are being used when we're learning. But one of the reasons I initiated this project into leadership is because for the last 20 years, I've been teaching leadership and management, and all the textbooks that I have to support, my teaching have all been very Eurocentric focused, and I couldn't see myself in those, in
Mm.
what I'm teaching. And I think as teachers, we have to, especially as teachers in a social scientist environment, we have to convey some of our own essence in what we teach. And if we are not using resources that tell our story in a way, it's kind of a bit, there's something kind of not quite, um, there's something not quite right in the material that we're using. If there's nothing of ourselves in it, we can try and distort it, you know, and try and kind of like put ourselves into it. But I teach using Porter, you know, all of the traditional American gurus of management and leadership. And it's like, well, what about the leadership of, you know, that is going to appeal to a more diverse environment?
Well, that brings me to a point that I'd like to share with you is that I've been fortunate enough to go and mentor some teachers, directors, principals all over the world. And one of the places that I was invited was to go to, you might have heard of it, Badu Sahib. Have you heard of Badu Sahib? It's in Himachal Pradesh in India, and the founder, Baba Iqbal Singh ji, he just recently passed away. He had, and he was actually a disciple of Sant Teja Singh. I don't know if you know him, or Sant Other Singh. So there's a big
Yeah.
lineage there. But this particular time and period of that place is that they have opened up, I believe, 129 schools in rural areas in India, so, which are designated to help children who have no financial support, or women who need extra support, etc. Anyway, their schools, the director of their system that is being produced over there, they call it the value based education, wanted to upgrade the way children are taught. And so I was invited to go and teach them the inquiry method of education, and to mentor their leaders into bringing learner-centered education into the classroom, rather than the one that we have presently almost everywhere, where I teach, you write, you memorize, or you regurgitate the material to me, then you get the high marks, you've passed, and that's the system that we go through. So the emphasis always being on the marks rather than what you have learned inside you. So obviously, this was a big challenge to, first of all, to bring any change into a system that has been, in practice for so many years. It's crazy, trying to change the mindset, but that's okay. The change has to begin somewhere, and the teachers were extremely open to it. Here was a plot where they could participate with their students by telling them, you tell me what you want to learn about. It's asking the questions and what interests you. What are you passionate about, rather than here's what you got to learn, do it and forget it. But they saw this big change in the students, because all of a sudden, what? You actually care for what I want to learn about? So they were given the opportunity to try and bring this system into the school. And it is, I congratulate the leaders of the education system over there, who had the foresight to say, hey, something else is happening out there in the West. More and more schools are turning into a learner-centered approach of learning. Maybe we should do the same. And so that's what happened. And they ended up getting a school which was international baccalaureate program, where everything is based on inquiry,
Mm.
and inquiry being a form of enhancing your creativity, of your inside flowering itself to bring forth what, like what the idea that you were saying, like the consciousness has now shifted in such a way that you're not fenced into something and say, all right, here's your boundaries, here's what you got to produce, here's that. But instead the boundaries are erased, and say, what are you capable of coming up with? And oh my gosh, they surprise you. You think, oh my, how did that happen? So
Mm.
I'm very passionate about bringing this sort of education model to everywhere. Like I want our Sikh students to be in that format. In especially in religion also, to understand not things that have been told us over the years and just take them and say, oh, this is okay, this is the truth, this is all, but experiment inside with it and see what it brings out for you. What's the
Mm.
message it has personally for you about this omnipresence, this oneness that I want to see, in everyone, in all the groups that we see?
Yeah, as you were talking, it reminded me of Paulo Freire's work, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Are you
Mm,
familiar with his work? The Brazilian author,
I
Paulo
know.
Freire.
No. Hmm.
Yeah, Paulo Freire, back in the 80s, he wrote Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and he was actually put in prison for his work. And he was he was tortured in prison. Then he had to go and live in exile in Chile for a long time because Pedagogy of the Oppressed, it was changing, it was a paradigm shift. Instead of this metaphor of the student being an empty vessel or like an empty bank account where
Oh, yes,
you
I
had to
remember this. Yes,
deposit,
yes,
see,
yes. Uh-huh.
so instead of the banking model of like the
Mm,
teacher has to deposit, to the capabilities of the empty account or the empty vessel, as it were, and he
mm.
changed the metaphor of like, well, education needs to be like lighting a fire. We light the fire, and at that time that was a very controversial, that was a radical message, to empowering the poor people was too much of a threat to the status quo, and that's why he was tortured, and that's why even the current president of Brazil, he's trying to take away all the statues that have been erected to commemorate Paulo Freire. Because he gained prominence after his death mostly, and but now there's kind of like this switch again back. History kind of repeats itself sometimes. And the other thing you said was this whole concept of like, well, I suppose it depends on the subject that we're teaching. Because I am positioned in social sciences, I can see that how education needs to be like a fire that is lit, whereas maybe in the natural sciences, they might have a different idea about that. Because with chemistry, for example, we we have to have parameters in place for, it's a very different subject. What we do with the chemicals, it needs to be guided. It can't simply come from the
Absolutely. The
whim of
guidance, the
students.
guidance simply has to be given, but in a format where the kids can come up with their solutions to it. Okay, of course, there are some things that you need to tell them about. That's the content material of it. But to be able to experiment and discover it for yourself, the same thing that somebody else did it a long time ago, and be absolutely amazed by what is happening by a few changes here and there, depends on the teacher and how he or she is able to bring that amazement, and create an environment in which they can create their own solutions.
Mhm. Yeah, so we have these
Can
kind of
happen.
different
Can happen in
pathways.
any figure, any subject, I believe,
Mm,
whether
right.
it's math or English. Even creativity in English is important. It's not just about reading a book, but so many more things at different levels. So
Yeah, it's this kind of conflict between or the tension at least, between what we call the scientific method. We can experiment, trial and error, but a lot of teachers, in my experience, they will say they don't have time. They have
oh
only
yes,
an
yes,
hour.
time
They have an
wasted.
hour with their students, and they know what they have to teach in that hour. And if they leave them to their own devices, they're just going to take too long. And so that's usually the thing. It's like a lot of the creative work can't happen within the classroom. It has to happen outside of the classroom. It has to happen in the real world, as it were.
I know, because it's the limitations that we have put on the education system, the time, what's to be produced, and the content material that has to be covered. But there are now schools that, in fact, my daughter-in-law is now doing this. It's called boundless education in Portugal. And there's no set curriculum anymore. But yet put that student next to another one who's following a curriculum, and they will have learned almost the same amount, but perhaps to a deeper understanding of a subject.
Mm,
Because we are so driven by content and curriculum that we forget to nurture the creative side.
mm,
And where do these time limitations come that we have put on teachers and say you must do this by this time and you must do this? So for me, I think that there needs to be a change in the way we give material out for teachers to say, you must get from page 1 to 200 by the end of term 1, and so that it's nothing but a race through these things.
mm.
However, imagine a system where you're given that liberty to be what you are, how you are. That's what I dream about. The best schools are in Finland, where their system is such that they don't test their children all the time. And so there's that, not that pressure on the teachers say, oh, they're going to be tested on this. They allow that creativity to emerge and flourish at the rate of each child at their own level. And then by that osmosis process, they learn from each other too.
Mhm.
And I dream of that education system being put into practice in more places rather than just, those that are exemplary.
Yeah, I mean, I have spoken with teachers in Finland about their prioritizing creativity, and again, we have to look at the context. The work environment in Finland, it's not as competitive as it is, let's say, in China, for example, where
Yeah.
there is a very high level of competition to get into the best universities, and maybe in Japan, similarly, there's a lot of competition. So again, it depends on, we have to look at things in context, but you're absolutely right that learning has to be meaningful to us, because when I look back at my secondary education and my primary school education, yes, of course I learned to read and write. I'm grateful for that. I learned how to do maths. I'm grateful for that. But I wish I had learned things that were meaningful to me in terms of, for example, the East India Tea Company. It was a company that managed to colonize my people. It was a business that managed to, just change the whole infrastructure of India and colonize it. We didn't learn that at school, and I think for somebody like myself, it would have been very meaningful for me to know why. I mean, I said quite recently, a few months ago, I remember saying to some of my colleagues, it's like, well, I'm here because British people like to drink tea. That's what brought me here. you know because
Yeah.
the East India Tea Company, that's how it traded. It managed to become so successful because tea, people hadn't heard of tea before the 1600s in Europe. And so, and then how can a business become so expansive that it takes over a whole subcontinent? That
Oh,
is something worth learning about.
Oh, absolutely. There's history, there is value in history, and to learn what was good about it, what was not good about it, and how it affected, the generations, not only then, but the ones that came later. And so, in terms of, changing systems, changing education, I think that we are going to be more and more driven towards homeschooling, as COVID has proven. For example, a lot of schooling went online. It's not the best way to learn because, first of all, not everyone was trained in that. But given the 2 years of experience, the teachers beginning to learn about this kind of formation of learning, technology is going to really drive education, and more and more things going virtual, and giving freedom for the students to learn whatever they want,
Mm,
basically. They're
that's
not
right.
in a classroom with a one textbook anymore. They're
Yes.
going to have the world at their tips, and they don't have to memorize it.
Mhm.
They can go click and find out what the East India Company was, and oh yeah, this is it, and that's all there was. And so technology has its advantages and also its disadvantages. But I did a thesis in basically online communities in gifted education at the time, and it came up with results that were astonishing. That how we can nurture these communities to produce scholars that have actually just depended on each other, and for growth and direction and creativity flowing through these conversations.
Mm. Yeah,
So
yeah, absolutely.
I guess
You see,
I guess I'm a dreamer.
yes. Well, the thing is that now the world, with coming into the fourth industrial revolution, these are the opportunities that the fourth industrial revolution is creating for us. The use of cyberspace. You and I wouldn't be able to have this conversation if it were not
Yes.
for cyberspace.
Hmm.
And so now, as you say, we have the choice, all of us, not just the children, but all of us at any age, we have the choice about what to learn, when to learn it, how we learn it, why we learn it. We have choices about that. But the problem that we have to, to be considerate of is ethics. Because a child can just as easily learn how to do things that are harmful, especially when they're teenagers and their hormones, and the dark side hasn't been developed and hasn't been kind of tamed, as it were.
Hmm.
Like ethical kind of issues about, are we learning what is going to be beneficial for the world, or are we learning what is just going to be individual pleasure, perhaps?
Well, there are pros and cons for everything, and I think we just move forward with it and basically have uh, choices that each learner has to make for themselves. And we provide as educators those opportunities where they are able to distinguish between where am I going with this, and choose the right spaces, as we do when we bring when we are bringing up teenagers. We have to let them know, or we somehow guide them to understand why this place we should go and why we should not go. Same way with online, and I think this is just going to be another learning experience that we have to overcome and um, go with it, with its uh, pros and cons,
Yeah.
and um,
Well, one of my colleagues was saying recently that they were advocating, it was a course that we were doing as teachers, and this colleague of mine was advocating group work for development of teamwork skills. And I said, well, our students from China and India, they've not come to school, they haven't paid like such large sums of money, they haven't invested all that money to learn how to develop teamwork skills. They learn that through their family, through their community. They don't they don't need to come all the way across the world to learn teamwork skills through doing group work, and I think the onus needs to be on families and societies and communities to be teaching skills which are not, we can't rely on a classroom environment to be teaching these skills in terms of determining what is right and what is wrong, and what keeps a family together and what tears it apart. We can't rely on school to teach us that. The ethics needs to be taught through osmosis, through all these extracurricular activities, doesn't it?
community osmosis, and at a communal level, we are, I think, blessed in Sikhi with the concept of seva. And when children get involved with that, they automatically begin to learn that, there is something else than being always self-centered, and you've got to get out of yourself and help someone who is in need. And there comes that community seva. And yes, and it's very important, and something that needs to be taught at all different kinds of levels, and that's education, I think. The first step of education, if you want, I can be as intelligent as I want, but if I don't know how to deal with somebody else and be helpful to my human colleague, then what's the point of that education?
Mm.
So
Yeah.
that level, whether it is connecting at that intellectual or spiritual or mental emotional way, these are levels that we learn slowly, but throughout our life. I think it's an ongoing process.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Okay, well, um, thank you ever so much for this wonderful conversation. I've really enjoyed speaking with you, and
Same
I could
here.
carry on. I could carry on, but I will let you go now and leave the the remaining kind of things that we could discuss for another occasion, hopefully.
That would be wonderful. Thank you so
Okay,
much for reaching
wonderful.
out,
Thank
and
you.
uh, loved hearing what you had to say. Thank you once again.
Okay, thank you.